Matteo is an introverted young man who accepts the job of night watchman at his town's cemetery. It's a quiet job, perfect for someone looking to get away from the hustle and bustle. The nights are cold, but silent. The only company he has are the shadows of the tombstones and the faint whisper of the wind. However, one night something breaks the monotony. The door to the main mausoleum is ajar. It is strange because he always makes sure to close it at the beginning of his shift. Thinking it is the work of some curious person or prankster, Matteo closes it again and returns to his hut. But at dawn, he finds it open again. The following days, the pattern repeats itself. Even after making sure to close it tightly, the door always appears open. Upon inspecting the interior, he finds nothing out of the ordinary, except a heavy air that makes him feel as if he is being watched. Matteo begins to notice more disturbing details. Some nights he hears soft footsteps, as if someone were walking among the tombstones. At other times, distant murmurs seem to emanate from the darkness. He decides not to mention it to anyone for fear of losing his job, but the tension grows. One early morning, fed up with the situation, he plucks up his courage and enters the mausoleum with a flashlight and a stick to defend himself. The place is cold and dark, with a smell of dampness and old stone. In the center is a large coffin surrounded by Latin inscriptions. Suddenly, the lantern flickers, and a thud behind him makes him turn suddenly. In the darkest corner, he sees a hooded figure, bent over an open book. His bony hands turn the pages calmly, as if he doesn't notice his presence. Matteo, terrified, demands to know who it is. The figure slowly raises its head, revealing a pale, empty face, like a mask made of dried skin. The hooded man stares at him before speaking. "I am the chronicler of this place. I write the history of every soul that crosses this land." Matteo, incredulous, asks why it is there. The chronicler shows him the book, which contains hundreds of names and dates. Each entry narrates the life and death of the people buried in the cemetery. But as he turns the pages, Matteo sees something that chills his blood. His own name appears at the bottom of the list. His entry is incomplete, except for a recent line that reads, "Date of death, tonight." Desperate, Matteo tries to close the book, but the chronicler stops him with superhuman strength. "You cannot change what is already written," says the figure in a cavernous voice. Matteo runs out of the mausoleum, but the cemetery seems to have changed. The paths are crooked, the tombstones are in different places, and a dense fog envelopes him. His whole body trembles as he feels someone following close behind. Suddenly, he stumbles and falls in front of a tombstone he had not seen before. When he looks up, he reads his name engraved on the stone, with the current date inscribed on it. As he tries to get up, the chronicler appears behind him, whispering in his ear, "The end was already written. All that was left was for you to accept it." The fog covers it completely, and Matteo's cry is drowned in the silence of the cemetery. The next morning, the mausoleum is closed as usual, but a new entry appears in the town's death register. Matteo Lopez died of unknown causes. In a small mountain village, the local cemetery is a quiet and forgotten place, where most of the graves are covered with moss and the flowers have disappeared over time. Paula, a young florist who inherited the family business, lives a monotonous routine tending her small store. Lately, she has noticed that large bunches of fresh flowers disappear from her inventory every night. Intrigued, she checks the security cameras, but detects no one entering the store. The flowers simply disappear. One night, while returning home late, she decides to take a shortcut through the cemetery. What she sees perplexes her. Several graves, once abandoned, are adorned with their missing flowers, arranged in an almost reverential order. Although the find seems strange to her, she attributes it to some eccentric neighbor. But the disappearances continue. With a mixture of curiosity and fear, Paula decides to investigate on her own. One night, armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, Paula waits hidden in her tent. At 3 a.m., she hears a soft rustling. Without hesitation, she follows the noise to the cemetery. There, in the shadows, she spots a hunched figure placing flowers on a grave. "Hey, you," Paula shouts. The figure stops. Slowly, it turns its head towards her, revealing an aged and deformed face, as if the skin is partially decomposed. Paula steps back, but the being vanishes into the mist, leaving her alone in front of a grave that has been abandoned for years. Inspecting the place, she finds something even more disturbing: a headstone with a name she hadn't noticed before. The flowers are not in disarray, but arranged in exact patterns around each grave, as if someone had memorized where to place them. The most puzzling thing happens when Paula notices that the dates on the tombstones are very old, from people who died more than a century ago. That same night, while researching in the town archives, she discovers that many of the names on the tombstones correspond to members of a family that mysteriously disappeared during the yellow fever. Local legend has it that they died in such terrible ways that they didn't even have proper funerals. The next day, Paula decides to return to the cemetery with more questions than answers. This time, she takes a camera with her to document any anomalies. What she records terrifies her: humanoid figures walking among the graves, chatting with each other, but in a language she can't understand. The cameras capture the shadows, but the faces of the figures appear distorted and formless. Realizing she is in danger, Paula tries to leave the cemetery, but the paths seem to change. No matter how far she walks, she always ends up back in front of the same graves. A childish voice breaks the silence: "Why do you want to leave?" Paula turns and sees a little girl standing in front of her. The girl holds a flower in her hand and looks at her with dark, expressionless eyes. "You brought us flowers too," says the girl as she points to a grave next to Paula. When Paula looks, she is horrified to see a new gravestone bearing her own name. At her feet is a bouquet of fresh flowers from her store. Stepping back, she feels a cold hand on her shoulder. Turning, she sees the figures she had seen earlier in the shadows, surrounding her, smiling mischievously. Fog shrouds the place, and Paula feels the ground give way beneath her feet. Her last thought before she is sucked into the darkness is that she should never have entered the cemetery. The next morning, the villagers find her store closed and abandoned. No one knows what happened to Paula, but in the cemetery, a new gravestone decorates the grounds, surrounded by fresh flowers. Apparently, the nighttime visitors had found a new member for their community. Sebastian is a struggling writer, struggling to pay his bills. He accepts an unusual job. A cemetery manager hires him to write custom epitaphs for old, neglected graves. The idea is to renovate the place and make it more attractive to the town's historic visitors. The job seems straightforward. Sebastian spends his mornings researching in the cemetery archives and his afternoons writing poetic and thoughtful phrases. At first, everything seems normal, but as he progresses, he begins to notice something strange. The inscriptions he handwrites in his notebook automatically appear carved on the headstones the next day, without him or the cemetery caretakers doing the physical work. As Sebastian works in his notebook, the camera can show that the words he writes begin to appear, very faintly, on nearby gravestones, as if they are absorbing his thoughts. One day, Sebastian finds a gravestone with no name or date on it. Intrigued, he decides to write something original and a bit somber. "Here lies he who lived without being remembered, and died without being mourned." The next day, he returns to the cemetery and finds that tombstone with his inscription, but also with a name: Sebastian Rojas. The date of birth matches his own, but the date of death is the following day. Horrified, Sebastian tries to erase the inscription from his notebook, but the words seem to be engraved on the paper. Moreover, every time he tries, he feels a sharp pain in his chest, as if he were connected to the tombstone. He decides to confront the cemetery manager, but the manager tells him that there has never been a headstone without a name on the site. That night, Sebastian has nightmares. He dreams of spectral figures surrounding him, whispering the phrases he himself has written for other epitaphs. When he awakens, he finds his notebook open on the table, with new inscriptions written in his own handwriting. These describe in detail his life, including episodes he had never told anyone about, such as mistakes, betrayals, and dark moments. Increasingly disturbed, Sebastian returns to the cemetery with the intention of destroying the tombstone. But when he finds it, he sees that it is now surrounded by other tombstones with names he does not recognize. What is most disturbing is that each tombstone seems to be looking back at his own, like silent witnesses. In desperation, Sebastian picks up a hammer and begins to strike the tombstone with his name on it, but it does not break. Instead, he feels his own body begin to weaken with each blow. As he struggles to stand, he hears a deep voice behind him. The end has already been written. You cannot escape your story. Sebastian turns around and sees a tall, dark figure, his face hidden by a hood. This figure holds a book identical to Sebastian's notebook. The pages are filled with names and epitaphs, and at the bottom of the list is Sebastian's name, with a detailed description of his death. He died in a desperate act, trying to change the inevitable. The figure closes the book tightly, and Sebastian feels his heart stop. The screen goes dark, and the sound of a pencil writing fills the silence. The next morning, a new epitaph appears on Sebastian's tombstone. Here lies Sebastian Rojas, who learned that destiny cannot be rewritten. As the camera zooms out, another young writer is shown entering the cemetery, greeted by the same administrator who hired Sebastian. The cycle is about to begin again. Sometimes, the desire for immortality can become a prison. And for those who try to write destiny, the price can be the soul itself. In a small town, there is an abandoned cemetery at the edge of a forest. Surrounded by rumors and legends, it is said to have once belonged to a wealthy family that mysteriously disappeared more than a century ago. The place has been the subject of horror stories among the town's teenagers, who often dare each other to spend a night there. Group of 4 friends Sofia, Marcos, Daniel and Carla decide to explore the cemetery's largest and most famous crypt on Halloween night. Fueled by excitement and skepticism, they bring flashlights, cameras and supplies, convinced that there is nothing to fear. Upon arrival, the atmosphere is eerie, the air is strangely cold, and the place seems even more dilapidated than they remembered. In the center of the cemetery, an imposing crypt awaits them, its door ajar. Carla, the most skeptical, scoffs at her friends as they enter, but the group soon realizes they are not alone. Inside the crypt, they find a large, dark space, with shelves full of urns and coffins stacked on the walls. Everything seems covered in dust and cobwebs, but there is one puzzling detail: a small trail of footprints on the floor, as if a child had been walking there recently. Suddenly, they hear a soft sobbing sound that seems to come from deep in the crypt. Mark shines his flashlight and reveals a small boy, about 7 years old, sitting in a corner. The boy is dressed in old, faded clothes and looks disoriented. "Are you lost?" asks Sophia, trying to sound calm. The child looks up, showing sunken eyes and an expressionless face. "I can't find my mother." "Can you help me?" she says in a muffled voice. Moved by compassion, the friends decide to help the boy. He leads them deeper into the crypt, through seemingly endless corridors. However, as they advance, they begin to notice that the air becomes heavier and that the walls are covered with inscriptions in a language they do not recognize. Carla, the most impatient, stops and says, "This doesn't make sense. This is a joke, right?" The boy stops and stares at her. "I shouldn't be here," she mumbles, but no one understands if she means it for her or for everyone. Before long, the group returns to the same place where they started, despite having gone in Different directions. In the center of the crypt, they now find a tombstone that was not there before. It is small, and the child's name is engraved on it. The boy begins to cry again, but his cry turns into a chilling laugh. I've already found my mother. But you guys still have nowhere to rest. The flashlights flicker and go out, plunging the friends into darkness. When they manage to turn them on again, the boy has disappeared, but in his place are elongated shadows moving along the walls, taking human forms. One by one, the shadows materialize as spectral figures that begin to surround the group. Mark tries to run for the exit, but the crypt door closes with a clang. Daniel finds an inscription on the floor: "He who enters does not leave." Sophia screams as she sees the tombstones around them begin to change, engraving the names of each of them with dates of death marked as the current night. One by one, the friends are pulled into the shadows, dropping their flashlights and cameras. Thank you for staying with me. In some places, the dead do not rest alone. And those who cross their thresholds may never return. Hugo is an archaeology student with an obsessive interest in the history of ancient cemeteries. When he hears about an abandoned cemetery in a remote valley, known for its strange tombstones with no names or dates, he can't resist investigating it. The place is reputed to be the Cemetery of the Forgotten, where those whose lives were so obscure or shameful that their names were erased from history are supposedly buried. Hugo becomes convinced that he might find an important discovery, something that would make him stand out in his field. When he arrives, he notices that the cemetery is in a state of extreme neglect. The headstones are split, the grass grows unchecked, and an air of desolation envelopes everything. However, what strikes him most is an imposing statue in the center, a weathered marble angel that seems to watch over the place. Hugo begins to explore the cemetery, taking notes and photographs. He discovers that some tombstones have strange markings, like symbols that appear to be from a lost alphabet. At one of the graves, he finds a small medallion buried among the stones. The object is cool to the touch and seems to emit a slight glow in the dark. That night, while camping near the cemetery, Hugo hears murmurs. At first he thinks they are animals, but the sounds turn into whispered words. He recognizes fragments of what seem to be confessions. "I'm sorry, I couldn't stop it. I promised to keep the secret." Hugo decides to return to the Marble Angel the next day. Upon closer inspection, he discovers that the statue has its hands outstretched, as if it were holding something invisible. Intrigued, he places the medallion in the angel's hands. At that instant, the air around him seems to grow heavier, and a loud sound of moving stone forces him to step back. The angel's mouth slowly opens, revealing a hidden opening with a scroll inside. Hugo takes it and discovers that it is a list of names, all crossed out except for his own, which appears at the bottom of the list as freshly written. Confused and frightened, Hugo tries to leave the cemetery, but cannot find his way out. The paths seem to change, always leading him back to the angel. As night falls, the murmurs return. Now clearer. The shadows of the tombstones seem to move around him, and dark figures begin to appear among the trees. Hugo realizes that he has unleashed something he does not understand. In a desperate attempt, he tries to return the scroll to the angel, but the angel's hands are no longer outstretched. Instead, the statue has changed position, looking directly at him. Shadowy figures surround him. One of them, with a disfigured face and glowing eyes, whispers in his ear, "You took what does not belong to you. Now you are part of the secret." Hugo tries to run, but the shadows immobilize him. The camera shows how the statue of the angel begins to move, with a crackle of stone. It extends its hands towards Hugo, who is sucked into a whirlwind of darkness. At dawn, the cemetery seems as quiet as ever. The camera zooms in on the angel, who has returned to his original position. However, He now holds a new medallion in his hands, with Hugo's name engraved on it. At the base of the statue, the inscription changes and reads, "One more to keep secrets." Some stories were never meant to be unearthed. And those who search for them often find more than they were prepared to discover.